That's good.
especially since a lot of it deals with like patriarchy.
Here comes Dr. Mary
Okay.
Jo.
Yeah.
I just let her in.
Okay, great.
Okay, and it looks like we can be heard. Is that true, Foxy and Mary Jones? And you won't see them unless they decide to open their cameras, so don't worry about not seeing them.
Okay,
Okay,
We hear you fine.
thank you, Fox.
okay,
All right,
so
Here
what
we
I'm
go.
thinking is whenever it's like biblical, do you want to read the biblical? I can do that. Okay, cool. Okay, super. So I'm really excited to be here tonight. It's really weird to look up there, but
That's okay.
anyway, I wanted to talk tonight about Hagar, and I wanted to talk about womanist theology. And I wanted to talk about Hagar through the prism of 3 specific ideas. In the context of patriarchy, in the context of ethnic racial oppression,
Mhm.
and also in the context of the role of faith, kind of mystical role of faith, the power of language, and also the idea of ultimate liberation through God, through contact with God, through God's intervention. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first talk about the Frymer-Kempski point, since we all have that, right?
Yes.
And we can all dive into that.
Mhm.
And then I'll just follow up with a couple of other points, but I invite everyone to weigh in, like a passage that you think is relevant.
Okay.
Or, you know, anything that you think is relevant to the conversation, since we've all read pages 225 through 237. So, and I got all of the content from FK from this. Okay. Okay, so first we're going to clip a video,
Okay,
and I want you to watch this video. This video is very important,
all right.
and it's real short, and it's for kids.
So what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to turn off the sound.
All right, check.
No, because you're talking to this when I do it, right?
Hold on.
Some people.
Check. Perfect. Here we go.
Bible Stories proudly presents Hagar and Ishmael. Baby Isaac grew strong and began to walk and talk. Abraham was proud and held a great banquet. But Ishmael was jealous of Isaac and began to mock. Sarah became upset and voiced her regret.
Abraham, get rid of Hagar and get rid of her son. Ishmael mocks Isaac because he is jealous. He cannot share inheritance with my son. Ishmael is very rebellious.
Abraham became upset. He had to send Ishmael and his mother away. But God spoke to Abraham.
Don't be distressed. Listen to Sarah, and I will make sure everything is okay. It is through Isaac that my promise must be kept. Ishmael is rebellious, but he is your son. So I will bless Ishmael, and he will become a great nation. But they must leave your camp. Make sure they are gone.
Through the Beersheba desert they made their trek. The desert was very hot, and they ran out of water. Hagar laid Ishmael in the shade because he was dying of thirst. She wept because they couldn't go any farther. If Ishmael died, her heart would just burst. The angel of the Lord asked Hagar,
Don't be afraid. What do you need? The Lord heard Ishmael crying and sent help right away. Ishmael will be fine, this I can guarantee. See, there is a well just a little further away. Take the boy by the hand and let him drink all he can. It is his destiny to become a great nation.
God was with Ishmael all the days of his life. He lived in the desert and became a famous archer. Hagar went to Egypt and found him a wife. Ishmael thrived since his departure. Thanks for watching. This was part 15 of Abraham and Sarah's story in our Genesis series.
All right. Let's put the other microphones back up.
My son and I veggie kids.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Those were awesome.
Okay, I think we're good now. Can you hear us, Foxy and Mary?
Yep, I can hear you.
I think that might mean yes.
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
You can't hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I can.
Okay. We'll talk to the camera. Okay, great. So first of all, let's look at that video, right? And what do you observe? So when we think about the Hagar story, and we look at it in a womanist tradition, we kind of project American, traditions onto it.
Mhm.
It's easy to racialize it in a way that we understand, right?
Hmm.
And so I want you to look at the fact that those are mainly women of color, Semitic women. And so that's the basis for this conversation, but that is not to say that it is not a good symbol for African-American women, right? The trope, and for all women who've been oppressed historically. So a couple of themes from Friar Kimsky that I'd like to call out is that the story is very common, right? There are two women and there's one man, and the man has all the power, and the women are basically competing with each other. And that is a byproduct of patriarchy. That is a byproduct of being powerless. And so the only way that they're able to get power is through fertility or through marriage, right? Or through God. So God is another source of power. As a surrogate, Hagar was part of a tradition that dates back to 1900, before the Common Era. And also we should note that Sarah herself, or Sarai as she's called here, was taken as a slave into Pharaoh's house.
Mhm.
So she too was a slave. So when she encountered Hagar and chose to oppress her, she made a decision that she could have turned into solidarity, but she did not. And that's a very universal common thing. Let's see. Okay, now I want to follow up with Dolores Williams, and I wanted to just show the book. Do I have the book here?
Yeah, Nicole,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I didn't know that Sarah was a slave.
Yes.
Yes, it's Genesis 12, or is it 15, when Abraham and Sarah go into Egypt and he denies that she's his wife, and because he's always afraid that they're going to kill him and steal her,
Right.
and so she's taken to be part of the harem.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Pharaoh wants to have sex with her,
Yeah.
right?
Well, yeah.
And
There was a second incident too, and I can't remember the name of the king, but he had a dream that said that she was someone's wife, and never touched her, but she was still part of the harem.
Right, that was Gerar, that was. he
That's
was
the
king of
name.
R-A-R, yes, that's right. Mhm. But so that happens twice to Sarah, that Abraham denies that she's his wife,
Okay.
thinking he's protecting her, really knowing he's protecting himself
Right.
more.
Right.
Yeah, the patriarchy acts in a pretty nasty way.
Okay. Here's the book.
Mhm.
Okay, so Dolores Williams makes the point that motherhood is often a forced condition. In this case, a wealthy free barren woman is privileged over a fertile, younger enslaved woman. And she also makes the point that slaves exist to solve the owner's problems. And that Hagar is the foundation of womenist theology. It's important here, and we're gonna actually touch on that in the next section, that we remember that slavery was very common. It wasn't, it wasn't an aberration. There did not seem to be any moral outrage
Right.
about slavery. It was a natural fact of life as much as, oxygen or anything like that. So, and then finally, from helpmates, harlots, and heroes, which
Triple H.
Triple H, we call it. I love the way Alice Ogden just kind of summarizes this and says, the story of Hagar is the story of the struggle for status. And again, all of this is played out in the context of patriarchy. Okay. So there's an additional source, like I've been reading a lot of other people, who I will talk about later, but basically the takeaway quote is, God sees who Hagar is. He sees her as a human, right? He sees her. He sees Hagar as a matriarch, a people maker, and a nation maker. So he sees her value. Would anyone like to talk about this theme of patriarchy and what she took away from FK?
Well, one of the things that really stood out to me among many things, this was actually the first time that I had encountered this story. So, and also what I learned from watching the class. So
Yeah.
it's been a really, really fulfilling week in terms of my learning curve. But, one of the things that FK says that that resonated with me was the way in which Hagar is not an outsider, right? That she's an insider.
Right.
So this notion of, which is a very
But her name can mean outsider too.
well,
Yes,
right. Well,
yes,
here we go.
yes,
So there's a
right,
very,
yes, that's
in
right.
terms
Yeah,
of
sorry.
womanist theory, there's a central concept that you may have talked about in the class called outsider within.
Yeah.
And so this notion that Black women in America and other groups, right, in other contexts are insiders and outsiders at the same time,
Yeah.
and the particular lens, right, that brings, and it's similar to Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, but this notion that, and it comes from also related to another classic concept in social theory, the stranger from George Kimmel. So outsider within is Pat Hill Collins, who is really just the queen of Black feminist sociology. This outsider within notion. But also related to the stranger, that the stranger is actually an insider who is separate enough, right, to be able to carry a certain kind of wisdom, right, in the group, right, as someone who can see what other insiders are not able to see, and that kind of being both in and out, right, just really stood out to me in Hagar. So as a component of, in this case, patriarchy or white supremacy or this sort of intersectionality. So,
Really interesting.
that kind of at the end, right, FK says, this is not a story, right? This is not a story of the conflict between us and other, but between us and another
Right.
us. And I just thought
Yeah.
that was, for me, was really telling, and just, so anyway, that's something to
Yeah,
start
thank
off
you
with.
for that.
Yeah.
And I love the way you connected it to double consciousness, right, as in Du Bois. And again, connecting those two realities.
One of the things since I feel like an old lady, but when I was a teenager, I participated in the women's movement. We even marched down Broad Street in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And so when I went to college, I also tried to get involved. Now was the group that everybody tried. But what I found, and why I didn't bother, but kept my feminism to myself, I held on to it. I didn't reject it because of this. But I felt that the women's movement was a white women's movement. And like all of the groups that I would go to were all white. There weren't any Black people. And then like issues of we want to work. We want to work.
Right.
So I'm looking at my mother and my aunt and all these other women who've
have
been
to
working
work.
their whole lives. And I'm going, these aren't the same issues. So this whole thing of a conflict between us and another us is definitely there. And the fact that Sarah, now that I know this, was herself a slave at one point, and did not identify. And so, and you get this, that you get a lot of times when white females don't necessarily identify with the oppressor because of their white privilege. And I think that has been like an issue for decades between the two groups of women.
I just read a novel, and then I've been looking at some nonfiction about it, but the Women's March, the suffragist march that happened the day before, I guess it was Wilson was inaugurated, and how the Blacks were kept on the side because they were afraid the Southern contingency was going to reject everything. And finally, a couple were allowed in, but it was totally a white woman's thing. An interesting thing in this, though, not just that the white people don't identify with the Blacks, but she makes the point of saying that people who were oppressed go on to oppress others, which I think like Israel is the perfect example of that. And like that's sort of universal, which is really very tragic.
People hurt others. Unless there's intervention.
So it's actually true of Irish Americans. I mean, Irish Americans, it was made pretty clear that most of the United States did not consider, the Irish white.
That's right.
Or at least, they weren't welcome. No Irish need apply. But once they were able to blend in and get past that, they were sadly often on the front lines of some of the worst nonsense, in this country, whether it was racial or whatever.
The price of fitting in was to give up your ethnicity a lot and to. Yes, right.
Now, the point you made, Reverend Scott, is something that just struck me last month during Black History Month when they were talking about the lynchings in New York and the fire at the orphanage being done by the Irish. And I started researching this because I had never heard of this. And these were people who had just been over here from being oppressed with the potato blight.
Yeah.
I mean, they were just here. And it's like, they just got the foot off their neck. They weren't even completely accepted into society yet. And here they are repressing others. It was like, that shocked me.
Well, it was calculated in some ways because the Irish, especially young Irish males, were deliberately recruited to be part of the police force early on. That's why, especially in New York and Boston and some of the big Eastern cities, to this day, there's a long history of Irish being in the police force, but they were given the power of exerting their physical testosterone laden, belligerence on people that the real power brokers wanted to keep in line. So I mean, there's a long history of this, and it is part of American history.
Yeah, and the thing that's striking, which the little cartoon that we saw really brought to light, was the fact that Sarah felt threatened by Hagar. And that often happens between white and black women, where the white female may feel in some way threatened. You know, thanks to affirmative action concepts, especially in jobs where they feel you're going to take their job, and so forth. And so therefore that being oppressed. And I would think that happened with the Irish too. Like some of the riots that happened during the Civil War when they were drafting, you know, and they didn't want to go and get killed by that time. They knew that if you went and fought in the Civil War, there's a high likely chance you were going to get killed. And so, and they're thinking, why should I do this for some black people that I don't even like? And so there's, you know, that issue.
It's like the lowest, what they call the lowest white man concept.
Yes.
Right.
You know, the
Right.
lowest white man still wants to think that he's, you know,
Right.
of more value
Yeah.
than any person of color, right? So that's sort of been a study.
Yeah.
phenomenon.
Yeah, I'm grading midterm exams where one of the questions is they have to talk about racial bribes. And the various moments in American history where the wages of whiteness, right, are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually Michelle Alexander and New Jim Crow sort of
yeah.
just tease it up. I mean, it's part of the, you know, social science and history. And so the extent to which various moments in American history where working in middle class, non-elite people could have united in a coalition against
sure.
economic elites, but the economic elites essentially bribe white people with privileges of whiteness in order to turn their backs on and return what is also a issue of wealth, right? Wealth battles into a battle over white privilege, you know, and that's happened, you know, at least for you know, in terms of real turning points for at least 4 major times in U.S. history. So anyway, just you know,
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Well, we've done a lot already.
Yeah.
That's a class.
So is it okay if I move on to the next?
It is, and I want to come back to slavery and talk about that in the context of the Bible, but I'm
Okay.
not going to step. any
Well,
way
you know
until
what,
keep
it's,
going.
yeah, so actually, the next thing I'm doing is
Okay.
racial oppression. So that's where we're gonna start talking about slavery. So basically, just in the context of FK, that's what I call her.
That's good.
So when the angel tells Hagar to return to her mistress, when she runs away while she's pregnant, they're acting in accord with Near Eastern laws. So again, it's the normalization of slavery. It's the normalization of oppression.
Yeah.
It was often used in American slavery as, see, look, it's in the
That's right.
Bible.
Yeah.
That's right.
Whereas I found out today that most other parts of the Old Testament, especially Exodus, were taken out of slave Bibles before they were given to slaves.
That's
So
right.
slaves received
Oh, wow.
heavily
I
redacted
didn't know
Bibles.
that. I was
Isn't that-
not
If they received any
surprised.
help, yes.
Yeah, because
Because
they
they
didn't want the
them to
idea
read like
of
it's-
freedom
yeah.
from
You
slavery.
didn't want the story of
Yeah.
Moses releasing
Right.
people
Right,
from
right.
slavery, rising up and leading.
So much of the Old Testament, obviously. Yes.
And yet they knew the story.
They still knew the story.
Right.
Yeah. And probably used it for themselves in a way that was very convenient. So yeah, there's that part. So look at Dolores Williams. She made a couple of really interesting points about how Hagar related to God. First of all, the deity that Hagar encounters in the wilderness, in her mind, is not the same God as the God of Abram and Sarai. It's not the same God
Okay.
in her
Okay.
way of feeling with this
That's
God.
right.
For Hagar and oppressed women after her, the wilderness is a place of transformation. Wilderness is a place where anything can happen. And I am actually going to have Deb read. And before I do that, let me just say that the story of Hagar is mainly explicated in Genesis 16 and Genesis 21. And here we have Genesis 16, and Deb is going to read the relevant part. So what happened was Hagar ran away first time when she was pregnant.
Mhm.
And the angel came and told her, you've got to go back to your mistress. That's the right thing to do, right? And she did. And then the second time when she was pushed out,
Right.
when Sarah was like, get her out of here.
Yeah.
That's when she also went into the wilderness and had an extremely transformative experience. And so Deb, would you please read what happens? Yeah, and we're in Genesis 16:7. Oh. right here. So what, just setting the scene, Hagar and her son Ishmael are in the wilderness together. And it's Genesis 16:7. And I will tell you, it's on page 229
Oh, dear.
of the Kindle.
Oh, I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, but it's very close.
It is very close.
Okay.
Do
Yeah,
you have it?
yes,
Yeah.
it is. It actually is here.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah,
Next
perfect.
time I want these kinds of pages.
Oh, this is,
so page 229.
Yeah.
this is
fine.
the library.
All right, here we go.
The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and summon to her.
Hmm.
The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count.
Mhm.
The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You should name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I understand
we're gonna
that.
finish that or?
Yeah,
Good.
you ready to talk about it? Thank
You wanted to wait for the Elroy, right?
Oh, yeah. Is it there? Yes, okay. Okay,
Because you were asking about that before.
Yes,
that's why
I
thought you
was.
wanted to-
this is a very important part. Thank you.
Yeah.
By the by,
What's that?
It- by the by.
Yes, right, if by the by, there you go.
Let me find it again. Ishmael translate to God pays attention.
Or God hears, yep.
Okay.
Yep. Go ahead, finish that passage here, Deb.
She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roy. It's still there between Kadesh and Bered.
Yeah, Kadesh and
They're at-
So let's look at the differences in translation,
Mhm.
because Primer Kennedy really pays attention to this one line, and I don't know what number it is, but the angel of the Lord literally says to Hagar, return to your mistress and be oppressed under
Yes.
her hand.
Yes.
No, it says
Yeah.
submit to her authority.
Submit to her authority. Well, it's
There are multiple
the
translations.
Hebrew Bible does use the words apparently oppressed under her hand.
No,
Interesting.
that's what I'm reading from, the Hebrew
Oh,
Bible.
you're-
It says submit to her authority.
Oh,
So
okay, there you go.
That's a big difference.
Well,
Yes.
White supremacy, I mean,
Yeah.
well, it's patriarchy, which,
Submit.
it's-
Yeah, but, right.
all right, cool. Anyway, good.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, Deb. I really appreciate that. Okay, so, let's see, we're talking about, right. So again, we are mentioning that Sarai herself was indeed a slave. Again, I wanted to look at some of the etymology, right, of Hagar. It comes from the word Hagar, which
Yes,
apparently
okay.
means outsider,
Right,
right?
right.
Canaanite, or is that correct?
I'm not sure. Might be Egyptian.
Okay, okay.
So you were calling them the Amorites at that time in history. The Amorites.
That's right, yes, yes. Okay, so, okay, the Hagar story, so according to Dolores Williams, the Hagar story establishes the theme of resisting and rising above for Hagar and oppressed women after her. Wilderness is a place of transformation, we talked about that. So now bringing it back to the African-American experience, Dolores Williams said, after emancipation, the whole world started to look like wilderness for Black women. Right? And she talked about like how that compares with Hagar, in that Hagar had absolutely no agency over her own reproductive potential, right? So you start to see the seeds of oppression, regardless of whom it's visited upon, is oppression. And for women, right, regardless of you oppress through reproductive potential. That's how you oppress. You control and you oppress. And so that is the beginning of that.
So let's just stop there for a
sure.
second, because there's a whole lot there. So obviously there's a lot in the news right now dealing with just this issue, right? You know, that all these, anti-abortion laws being passed that do not include exceptions for rape or incest. You know, I mean,
After like 6 weeks or
you
some
know,
random
it's like
number.
50
Well, when you
years
can't
ago.
possibly know you're pregnant,
Right,
so we're barely, so.
And so the interesting thing there is, are we really now saying that women should just simply, for the rest of their own, not just their own lives, but the whole life of their family line should now have to be,
Yes.
include the progeny of an attacker? I mean, that's what it says, right?
Yes,
Right,
that's
yeah,
right,
it
that's
is.
right.
That's what, well, actually, Amy Coney Barrett
Mhm.
said something to the effect, give them up for adoption.
Yes,
So
she did.
She's basically saying, bear the child.
Yes, she is.
And give birth to it and then give it up to adoption or put it in a foster
Let her
home.
bear the
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Let her
And
bear,
what, and to add another layer of Black feminist theory and how it's connected to reproductive justice, the whole reframing of reproductive freedom in, the contemporary period is, indebted to feminists of color who have argued that reproductive freedom is not simply the right to not be a mother, right? But
Right.
the right to be a parent
Right.
and the right to have all the resources to parent
That's
that
right,
child,
that's right,
right,
yes.
throughout,
Yep,
that
yep.
child's life. So just sort of thinking about that, as an
Mm.
overlay onto this, and then also thinking about the class, and I forgive me of the theologian
Mhm.
scholar who was, raised up in that class around what reproduction means, like women's, and not to, you may be going to comment on that, but in terms of, reproduction of a community, right? And the gifts of Black women as leaders of movements, and part of that is women's reproductive role as well. And that also fits into contemporary
I love that
womenist
metaphor.
theories of reproductive freedom and also labor, right? So,
Yes.
Right.
Yes, right.
control over sexuality, control over reproduction, control over labor,
freedom
and
that
use of
resources.
violence,
Right.
right?
And the freedom that you as a woman have when you are not, when you are allowed to control your own.
Well, that's right, your
reproductive
own body,
And what it
right.
allows you to do in the world.
Yeah.
When you can control your
Yeah.
own reproductive.
This line that jumped out at me is this quote, "womb with legs." Is a person with her own
Yeah,
viewpoint.
that's TikTok,
I mean,
putting her own. spin on
Yes,
it. Yes,
page
yes.
228,
What is it? What,
page 228, the
the
first,
chapter, the
Um,
verse?
it's the. it's-
Hagar, my other myself. It's our page
Yeah,
228.
Oh, it's in the book.
Yeah, not in the
Okay,
Bible, no, no.
okay.
But it's just like, oh, it was a person with her own viewpoint. Well, yeah, surprise.
Could I just bring up this whole thing? It's verse, I guess, 11. It says, now you have conceived and shall bear a son, and you shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man with his
Yeah,
hand
yeah.
against everyone and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with his kin. And I put in the margins, I said, this doesn't sound too good
Yeah,
to
no,
me.
no.
Another word,
What
it's
does
like
that-
over-
what does that
Onager,
mean?
onager.
Right, right.
What's an onager?
It's an Asiatic wild ass.
And so what was the point of that? Because I didn't get that.
So if he's going to be someone who with no parentage, with no father, with no fortune, who's going to father a nation, he better be able to take care of himself. It actually,
Okay,
some of the
so,
scholars think it's actually saying he will be a great warrior
Wow.
in a different way.
It
It's just
sure-
nobody will be able to conquer him. It doesn't sound like a,
it sounds
like a compliment to
terrible,
us,
right,
you know,
right.
by calling him a wild
Well, a little
house.
sketchy, Rep. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
He's
because-
gonna be a criminal.
Right, right.
Super
Because
predator.
this has been used
That's
to
all.
define black
Yes.
people. So Hagar
Oh,
was
interesting.
supposed to be the mother of Islam, right?
Well,
Yeah.
that's actually in the Quran. I think
Yeah,
it's
right.
going back to Ishmael.
And,
That's
and
correct.
so, and those, you know, I mean, now we just see them as people of color. And so so Ishmael was perceived of as being, you know, like the descendants of Ham, I guess, you
There's
know?
a piece of that, but then again, from our perspective, you know, one's Egyptian and one's, you know, Palestinian, Israeli, Iranian, you know, their skin color is probably remarkably close.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's absolutely,
Right.
that's right, that's right,
Yes.
that's right,
None of
yes.
them are really like, white, you know what I
Right,
mean?
right. We, except Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
He's
Blue
blue
eyes,
eyes,
blue eyes.
blonde
Right.
hair, gotta love it, blonde hair, right?
My dashboard, my mom's dashboard Jesus was blue
Okay,
eyes.
your mom-
When I first read this, I thought that Ishmael, when she left him underneath the tree, was a baby. And then I'm seeing, and it's like he's a full-grown man.
He's
So
14.
He's probably close to 8 to 11
Yeah,
when she finally
okay.
leaves because they gotta wait for Sarah to conceive, so it's somewhere around that.
Okay.
Hagar gave birth when Abram was 86. Sarah gave birth when he was 100. There's 14 years difference between them. So in that time, he was just hitting manhood.
He's just hitting manhood.
Got it.
Quite a
That's right,
guy.
that's right.
Yeah.
Thanks for that
Thank
correction,
you.
Sharon.
No problem.
Nicole, can I ask a question,
Sure,
or, and
yeah,
please tell me if
absolutely.
like not now?
No,
Okay,
please,
seriously.
absolutely.
So I had a question around, so it's on 233, since I know you're on the piece around
Mhm.
ethnicity and ethnicity. And at the top, it says, the narrator does not innocently identify Hagar as an Egyptian. No coincidence. It is a direct allusion to the central myth of Israel's origins. And then
Yes.
the next paragraph goes on to, talk then about Hagar then as, symbolic, right? A representative of the people of Israel, exploited, oppressed, degraded.
yeah.
Right.
Do we not? Okay. We're
So,
gonna
so
go there.
can you elaborate on that?
Well,
That's
I was just,
interesting,
it
like-
just seems, it just struck me again as related to FK's overall, like one of her overarching arguments, that the women in the Hebrew Bible are archetypes for the nation itself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
right, so the
Mm.
transformation of the
Yeah.
nation. So then what this means here about, well, I guess it's more of a question about, then what is this telling us about the tale of where Israel is in its history in terms of making, right, commentary or, right, or, about Israel as the oppressed, Israel, calling back to Israel's, right, roots, right, in slavery, and then what this means for Hagar to have this direct, relationship, or like being name called, right, with
Yeah.
God
Right.
as no other woman, or very few, right, at all. And so I'm just curious, that in terms of thinking about it as, right, this, intentional, right, an intentional characterization, like literally, right, of Hagar as Egyptian, and what that says about the larger story that is being told. And I don't have the answer. I'm just saying that's what it's, I'm learning more about what would be, what
I can
that
talk
says.
about it from a sort
Okay.
of a historical
Okay.
context.
Yeah.
Only meaning that, at this point, there is no Judah, there is no Israel. They still have not settled, into the quote unquote promised land.
Okay.
They're still outside of that. Doesn't happen until Moses, which comes later. And so what's going to happen here is that they're still traveling around. They're still nomadic. That's how, Abraham and Sarah end up in Gerar. That's how they end up in Egypt at one point. And then you'll see as this line goes on, when Jacob, who becomes Israel after who the whole country and all's named, when his sons come out, there's a drought. And so they have actually deliberately moved to Israel from Israel to Egypt, because there's more to be had. There's more of a land of plenty. They moved to the Nile Delta. There's evidence that that's where the Jews actually had moved to, the Nile Delta, which is a very fertile part of Egypt. And so one of the things that Genesis and the early books of the Bible like to do is they'd like to have these sort of echo stories. The slaughter of the innocents, we talked about that last week, and the going into and coming out of Egypt is another recurring theme of this part of the biblical literature. And it's supposed to remind you again and again that we were once a people without a land, but also to talk about this dynamic of coming in and coming out.
No, this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you. So one of the things I wanted to do to finish up this section, because this is going quickly, so if I could have a little more time, do you know who, I'm going to tell you her name, Reverend Will Gaffney, PhD. She is a Black Episcopalian priest she has PhD from Duke, and she has her Master's of Divinity from Howard, and I think she went to Earlham undergrad.
What's her name again?
Her name is Gaffney, Dr. Will. Yeah, and I'm
Will, W-I-L-L?
W-I-L. So I think it's Wilfred. Yeah.
Okay.
And so I
And
watched.
I'll share that link with the class when I send it.
That sounds good.
All right.
Okay, that sounds really good. Thank you so much. So anyway, I read a lot of her stuff, and she is a she's a very specific thing. She's a biblical scholar in Hebrew and Hebrew Bible, special interest in translation, textual plurality, feminist, womanist, and post-colonial biblical.
How do you put that in the door?
All of you.
Well, the post-colonial part,
Yeah.
I do know, I have a sense of what
What
that
is that?
means. So post-colonial is an analysis of the ways in which race, class, gender, nation intersect. So it's an intersectional approach on global inequality that tries to understand what are the relations of power in, after colonialism, right? So after, like in the, so it's a look at contemporary period, like now, looking at the extent to which capitalism, white supremacy intersects with empire building, and what is, right, the impact. And it's also has it has a particular also lens on identity. So like how people form senses of themselves and how they, right, like how we situate ourselves at the individual level within a larger context of those forces, and would say that the identities that we use that are available to us are themselves always socially constructed. So it's an, I got too into weeds, but it's an anti-essentialist, right, post-structuralist perspective on global race, class, gender, nation. Boom.
Wow.
And that is longer to get on the door.
Nicole, I believe Wilda Gaffney was the one I was telling you about, the Midrash, the womanist Midrash, an introduction to the woman of the Torah and the throne.
Yes,
That was
she's
the book.
And I spent all this time looking at her stuff online, and she went to Princeton and she studied this and she wrote a thesis on it, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just very excited about her. And she's really dynamic. Like I watched so many videos of her just looking, but here's something that she says. So because of what she said, I found out about these slave Bibles. You were here when I mentioned it, right? Okay. So this to me is just blew my mind away, because you can see the through line, right? You can see the through line from that construct and that oppression or that story, and then the midrash, right? And then different interpretations. And you can pull that through line all the way through to utilization of the Bible to justify and affirm slavery. And so Dr. Gaffney says here, we will not come to terms with the legacy of slavery in this country, nor all the horrors that descend from it, which continue to shape our world, without engaging, rebuking, and rejecting the normalization and sanctification of slavery in the text and views of the authority of Scripture that require uncritical acceptance. That will not be the end of white supremacy in the church, in biblical interpretation, or in the country, but it will be an unhooding. So the
It would
fact
be a what?
unhooding.
Oh, yes, I wanted to make sure we heard that clearly. That was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
As
So
in clanhood, I'm sorry.
yeah.
Right.
Yes. So I won't go on, but
Cool.
but Reverend Scott will send Link.
Mhm.
She's a remarkable
Mhm.
scholar, and, you know, she's a recent, you know, she's
Cool.
very contemporary, and I'm super excited about her. But again, to me, it makes me look at this text and I understand the symbolic value of Hagar. I understand the idea of Hagar as metaphor and the situations of patriarchy and,
Mhm.
and, you know, pulling through the oppression piece. But I don't trust exegesis, you know, I don't trust interpretations, because everything that we read, every interpretation that we see has been shaped by someone else.
Oh.
So when you talk about Hagar making God her own, right? She says to him, she names God Elroy.
I think she's the only one in the Bible who.
Really?
Yes,
Right?
yes.
Yeah.
Now,
Is that
invocation.
God or an angel?
No,
That's what
so-
I
well,
don't
That's
it's
know.
not-
God through the.
But she is. Somewhere, I guess they said on the thing, the link you had said something about how she sees God,
Yes.
but she's really interacting with an angel. So
Well,
that,
Yeah, it
could you
says
explain that
angel of
idea?
the Lord.
And then the Lord talks to her apparently, or is visible to her at that point? What is?
So the angel of the Lord language is problematic in interpretation, and I don't have enough Hebrew to answer this as I'd like. But often the angel of the Lord was meant to be a manifestation of the Lord itself, and not just a messenger. Like, so, because they talk a lot in Genesis and the early part of the Bible, how it's really impossible to look at God directly. If you think about Moses, you know, at the burning bush, the reason you have to look at a burning bush, because you can't look into the face of God, because you'll just incinerate or something. So whenever God is speaking, it's still God speaking and hearing, is what some scholars say, because we are not able to have that kind of direct encounter with what God is and God's fullness. That's how I understand that.
Okay, so whenever there's an angel of God speaking, we're to assume that that is means
In this part of
God.
the Bible, yes, it's a little different when you get to Christian scriptures, and like there's a
Okay,
multitude of angels doing something.
Yeah,
different.
right,
That's
right,
different.
okay,
But
yeah,
this-
yeah.
But if it's an angel, and
In the Hebrew
especially
Bible,
when she answers it, you know, and names it.
Right,
Yes.
right.
So go ahead.
Yes, okay, so, and I want to segue with one thing, actually, I'm sorry, I was trying to, right, okay, so we're talking about the invocation of God, right? Versus you calling God, God, to separate from Abram and Sarai, right? It's a separate dynamic and
okay.
relationship.
Uh-huh.
So, and I'm just gonna move on to that part now,
Hold on, let's stop right there, because I just
Yeah.
want to share one more thing about that.
yeah,
And that's simply this, that if you think about, those of you who remember this part of the Bible, the altar that's built in the Hebrew temple for the Judaic cult is the altar not upon which God manifests, but the name of God manifests.
Huh.
Judaism
Oh.
is very much tied to language. And so to give God a name is a remarkable amount of power in this religious system. It's not common. And that's why God's name is often spelled not completely,
Right,
just
right,
with what they call
right,
the tetragrammaton, the
right,
YHWH.
right.
You're not really supposed to say or write God's name.
And we
because
don't
there's so
put
much
the
power.
O in there, we don't. put the O.
But did this happen
Yeah.
because she was not one of the Hebrews, that she was knowing that she was Egyptian? So was that?
I
I don't know what
don't,
people think.
yeah, I don't know what you think, but I think it is simply, you know, her individual self, her soul, right? I think that she obviously was praying in some way, right, to some being.
Right, because she was
Yeah,
feeling
and she
bereft,
had
right,
faith,
for herself
Right,
and her
so,
son,
and
yeah.
she called when she saw that God came and put the well in front of her, and I will tell you the specific language actually
Mhm.
around it. So basically, Bir Haroy is the well, right? And the well is named after the encounter that Hagar had with God, where she says, El Roy, he who listens. And then she says something that sounds a little, you know, convoluted, a little fakachka, but it makes sense. It's like, wait, what is it? It is, I see, okay, you are El Roy, right? And then I see that you see me. What is the specific quote there?
Well, Primer Kinsky, I've just realized, Foxy and others, that Primer Kinsky is doing her own translation in this text.
Okay.
She's translating it herself from the Hebrew. That's why it's different from the Hebrew Bible. You are El Roy, the God of my seeing.
Yes.
Have I also come here looking after the one who sees me? And
Right.
therefore one calls the well of living when living one who sees me. So I've also come here looking after the one who sees me. So she's gone into the wilderness in part to find God
Right,
and find that
Right.
deliverance.
right.
That's how I understand. That's how I understand that. I don't know how you guys.
And
The,
then
He-
she'd
the
already,
Hebrew reads, have I really seen the one, capitalized, who sees me and stays alive?
Right.
Okay.
That's a wild one there. And
Yeah.
stays, because she sees him and knows that you're not supposed to survive that
Yeah,
encounter,
yeah.
right?
Okay.
That's fascinating.
and also she gets water.
Is there a bit of patriarchy in there?
That's right, that's right.
She gets water.
That's right, that's right.
You know,
Was there a bit of patriarchy in there when the angel, the second time comes, when the boy is under the tree and comes to her? Was there just a touch of patriarchy because he said that God is responding to the boy's cry, not to her prayers?
in my opinion, right?
It's all,
It's
it's
what
the context is.
like.
Well, the
it's
only
like
reason God,
patriarchy.
you could say the only reason God is actually following this woman
Right.
is because she's carrying the seed, remember our conversation last week,
Right.
of Abraham,
Right.
right?
Right.
Yeah,
And
but
the
he
fact that,
doesn't-
and the fact that Ishmael is the father of Arabs.
Well, that's true, but we don't know that in the text
Right,
yet,
right.
right? Yeah, that
No,
comes
we don't
later.
in the text, but we as modern people know.
Yeah.
But he's talking about, this is very confusing to me. So she's not of their tribe, okay? She's not, she's coming from a whole other different religious tradition.
Mhm.
That is not a tradition of a singular God, right? There are many gods in the Egyptian
Yes. And I
pantheon.
have something to say.
And so that's one thing. So why does she adopt these people's gods and then to have her descendants not be part of the tribe? They become something
A whole other
else.
tribe. Wow, that's a great question. Great question. Yeah.
Right, okay, so one connection could be, and this is from Dolores Williams, that El among the Canaanites, it's the highest God. So as you said, right, multiple gods.
Mhm.
El is the highest God among the Canaanites,
Mhm.
as of most Semitic peoples.
Mhm.
So it's a commonality, right? But it's still naming versus, it's still invocation. It's naming versus invocation. Okay, and one other point that I wanted to pull through with this is, let's see. I just want to talk about, yes, okay. So this is where it's really interesting, and this is first from FK. God's rewards come through the margins of society in the depth of degradation. And last week, Reverend Scott said something, or actually 2 or 3 weeks ago, Reverend Scott said something to us about like, how do the powerless have power? Because there are ways that the powerless use their powerlessness and all that goes with it to leverage situations to their advantage or their perceived advantage.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. Anybody want to respond to that before we move on?
Well, for me, it, calls back the weapons of the week
Mhm.
conversation we were having a few weeks ago. And I guess one of the things that I, try to keep my eye on is the difference between being able to respond to power or resist power and being in power. I mean, I just think I think there's usefulness to have some precision around having agency, right? And having power, right? I mean, people can be oppressed and can be members of subordinate groups and can be right and can have agency in resistance, but that's necessarily the same thing as saying that they have power.
Right.
I just think
That's
we have to
right.
be pretty clear-eyed about, what kinds of power we mean. Are we talking about wealth? Are we talking about political power? Organized, I mean, there's organized power, and then there's people that individually can
Right.
act to resist, and that has agency, right? And they, and that may lead to power, and it may be empowering, but it's not the same thing as having power. Power, I mean, sociologically speaking, right? That's why you invited me in, right? Is one way of thinking about it is the ability to act, to get your way when other
Right.
people
Well,
resist. And if we're
yes.
just gonna be,
Interesting.
I
Yeah.
mean, we could have a, and it's not like.
That's
there's
all linked into political power and wealth. I mean, I don't know how it can almost be separated because they're all.
Good political economists, there you are, yeah.
Take Ukraine, for example. We can send goods, we can send prayers, we can send all kinds of things, but that doesn't give the Ukrainian people the power to kick Putin's ass.
On the other hand,
Unfortunately.
the one thing about the power of the oppressed is that oppressed people tend to be cultured in that they understand the
Yes.
oppressor
Yes.
better than the oppressor understands them.
Of
Back to Du
course.
Bois, right?
They have
Always.
to.
Okay.
That's
And, right, exactly,
Mhm.
Du Bois.
He
So-
describes it in a little different way, but it's a similar. thing he's
Right.
trying to
Right,
remind us
so
of,
when I look at the Ukrainian situation, the Revolutionary War, you had guerrilla warfare, which the English had no concept of whatsoever. And, it went on forever, right? The war, it was like 8 years or something. But in the end, there was no way the British were going to win because they're going to and that's something that everybody, and Putin needs to be listening to this, is saying, excuse me, that there is no way.
That's right.
He's going
No,
to
that's
get
right.
Ukraine.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have this constant.
Yeah.
For years.
resistance.
Yeah, absolutely
That's
right.
why he's trying to level those cities.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
that's about the only way, because if you have to push the entire
well,
population.
it's right.
away.
Right. If you drive enough enough people out, then.
I see the Ukraine becoming the new IRA.
Mm.
Right,
Mm.
yep. I
And
agree.
there was one other comment here, related, well, it's adjacent. Okay, so, Dolores Williams makes the point, in light of Hagar's Egyptian heritage, in light of her brutal treatment by Sarai and Abram's complicity in this treatment, a question can be asked: is Hagar's naming action towards God a strike against patriarchy?
Oh,
Strike
interesting.
against the way. So that's a question. And then Triple H makes the point that,
This is Triple H.
Yes.
Okay.
from Joe.
I love it.
Triple H makes the point that Hagar makes God someone she can be empowered by.
Yeah.
Right, perhaps God is only interested because of Ishmael, right? And
Right.
because
But
her
she-
male progeny, but she leverages it to her advantage, right? Because her, I guess, what's the outcome? Like she depends on her son to survive ultimately. Ultimately, his fate is her fate as well, right?
Mm.
And so that's to be understood. And one other thing, just from watching Reverend Dr. Gaffney, she talks about this idea again of this idea of one God, but different relationships with God. So for example, Dr. Gaffney, like a lot of African Americans, is Episcopalian, and but it's a different, African Americans claim their Protestant religions in a different way, right? With a different approach to, different songs, a different way of relating to God.
Mhm.
A much more, in my experience, a much less formal way.
More personal.
I was gonna say more
personal.
personal.
Yeah, more
Yeah,
personal, more
yeah.
interactive,
Yeah.
more call and response. And it's, again, it's like them, like finding power in that setting. As people who traditionally have not had a lot of power, and to find power in the church by naming and by creating your own way of talking to God.
And also that you would have a lot of, like in the world, they could be maids, they could be cooks, that, low income
Yeah.
jobs, but in the church, they would have a powerful position.
Deacons,
Right.
like the men especially would have the big
Right.
positions.
And
but
so
women
did
would have
women.
this. Right.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Are women held
Yeah.
up more
Sure.
in black churches traditionally than in white churches?
We
Oh,
could
yeah.
stand with him.
The
From my
women were the
perspective,
black church.
remember,
Well,
Wendy
right,
comes
that's
from
true.
the Roman Catholic Church, but I have relatives
Right,
who
right,
are in the
right.
Black Church, and they definitely, from what I have observed, not,
Right.
that Black women.
They have a lot of power, but they're not always allowed to have positional power.
Right.
There are a lot of them
Right,
traditionally
yeah,
black
right,
churches,
right,
So they're
right.
not the bishops.
Yeah.
They're
That's
not-
right.
They're often not even the ministers. They could be.
Well, the
paid.
Episcopalians are, but AME
Well,
and Baptists are
Episcopalians
not.
are
The
pretty, yeah.
Episcopalians, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
you have some
And
AME.
Some may,
Yeah.
yeah.
AME, yeah.
But how long,
Yeah.
how recent is that? I'm
Not-
just
not
curious.
very-
I mean, like any other.
Yeah.
And in our town, Dr. Glover at St. Paul's Baptist, I
Yeah.
mean, she's the leader of that.
Right, and
congregation.
also the Trinity Presbyterian.
But they're
they have
Presbyterians,
the-
right, yeah, and you're right. Yep.
Yeah, and they always call, like, my stepmother is Mrs. Gray, like, we are like, I am my father's daughter.
Yeah, right,
That's it,
okay, so,
you know,
yeah.
like, I'm like, blah, blah, blah's daughter.
And the word Mrs. itself means belonging to, it's actually Mr. apostrophe S, it actually means
Right,
belonging to Mr.
Yeah,
Is where it comes
yeah.
from, so which is
Or they'll
why I
say,
try not to use it.
my
for-
dad has said, like, yes, you are the
your
mother
friends.
of my grandchildren. My dad's not sexist, but that is the at all, like, not towards me. But that is the understanding of
I came
it.
from a matriarchy. It's
Yeah.
very clear.
Anyway,
Yeah,
Um,
good, that's good stuff, thanks.
thank you so
Did
much.
not have
This is
to
great.
be my family.
What else you got for us, Nicole?
Very good, Nicole, thank you.
Can I
Yeah.
ask a
I'm ready
question
to
that you
great.
can say? it's
And I'm
okay?
ready to share if anyone else wants to talk.
I have I have a naive question about this story,
Yeah.
about this, this passage, these episodes, because at some point I felt like it's like the Netflix series that ends and you're like, we'll never
Yeah,
know what
right,
happens
right,
because they
right.
don't have a second season.
I
I
love
love
it.
it's a whole other story. No pun
That's
intended.
most of
Okay,
Genesis,
you know, like,
except for the main
okay.
family.
But I feel like, is this teeing up, like, it's sort of in the kind of, Hagar's metaphor for, for a nation to be that's not yet to be. And it's, they were exiled, but they were not, but they were free, I mean, so there's, so it's like, it's into the wilderness and it's freedom. And so, and it's like, and you're, and a recognition of the lineage, but two separate
Yes.
peoples that are part of an us. What's the rest of the story?
And
I'm like, it's
we
just,
know that Hagar
maybe
gets
we
a
know,
wife.
right? We know.
It's still being written.
Does
Yeah.
she drink coffee with her friends?
So,
I mean, what
yeah.
does she do, right? Does she play mahjong? Like,
Right,
like, no one cares.
She's
It's
free.
just about him,
Yeah,
right?
no, right.
She could die the next day.
Right, so
We
she's
wouldn't even
only
know.
important as the womb, more or less. the
Yeah.
end.
But you all are, much more advanced than I am in reading the text, so maybe there is a season 2, but I really felt like there was something here about the history that, was it just, setting up something so again, this could be like, don't take us there, Foster, we need to.
Remember the
No.
lens this is coming from?
Netflix, is
No.
there season 2?
I love that,
And I know Foxy
Yeah.
probably has something good to pop in here too, because I saw her trying to get in, so.
There's
Come on in,
in the
Foxy.
chat, what's
Yeah.
going on?
Yeah, remember the lens that this is all coming from, regardless of which Bible you're referring to. It was written by Jews.
Mhm.
They don't really
Okay.
care about the Arab history. If
Yeah.
you want to follow the Arab history, go talk to the Quran.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
You're more likely
And-
to find it there.
Mhm.
interesting.
Yeah.
That's a
Huh.
good
Yeah,
point.
as scholars, we learned that things are written through a lens. We have to remember the Bible was too,
Yeah.
regardless of
Yeah.
which one you're reading.
And if this story its origin is as ancient as we think, and if its authorship is about where we think it is, somewhere around the 6th century before Christ. You know, there was no people known as Arabs yet. I mean, Muhammad doesn't live until the 6th century after
Right,
Jesus,
right.
right? So it's not going to be in there.
But it's a setup for it, so why? And it's that,
Well, we're interpreting it as a setup for it. We don't know. I mean, the Muslims set it up. This is our backstory.
And for
We
good
don't know that this is.
well, that's
their
right, that's
backstory,
true, but it's,
You know, and it's like a lot of things that we now looking at the text will make a decision and say, aha, this is what.
Right,
And I read,
right.
I think it was in FK, that in the Islamic version, Hagar is actually a princess.
Yes,
who's
yes, I saw
married
that,
to
yeah.
Abraham, right?
Mhm.
Who's one of or something along those lines.
And it wouldn't make sense for the number one
Matriarch.
matriarch's number one slave servant to be someone of particularly low birth. It would have to be someone.
Oh,
Which kind of-
gonna-
Which kind of
Sure.
made me think that when Pharaoh threw Abram and Sarah out, that Hagar was one of the gifts he gave them,
oh, interesting.
because after they were out of Egypt.
Right, Hagar did come from a high station in the
Yeah,
Pharaoh's
yeah.
court.
Yes,
And
in some places she's translated as a princess.
Right, Pharaoh's
Yeah.
daughter.
the thing was, and I don't know if this is correct, Foxy, but tell me, basically that Pharaoh was so impressed by Abram and Sarai in terms of their things that they had going.
Yeah. So
Right?
I've got that. Let me.
They're like, let her go there because that's a really great place to go, right?
Yeah.
As a
Yeah.
slave.
Yeah, so it's in Genesis 12 where that story is of them going into Egypt. Genesis 12:10. And you know, once again, there's a famine in the land, so they go to Egypt, they go to the
Right, right.
Nile Delta. And then he's about to enter Egypt, and he tells his wife, who is still called Sarai, she
Right.
hasn't gotten the
Right.
name Sarah yet.
Right.
The Yah being of the Lord, of the first part of Yahweh, that's what
Okay.
that.
Oh,
is.
okay. Oh.
I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they're gonna say, this is
Right,
his
right,
wife, and they will
right.
kill me, but they will let you live. So say you're my sister.
Right.
So that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. I don't really care what happens to you now.
Right.
Oh, when
Right.
so he enters Egypt, and they saw that she was beautiful, and the officials saw her, and they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, and for her sake, he dealt with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, all this stuff. And then the Lord afflicts Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? You know, and so, you know, and this is the same thing that happens when Moses goes to Egypt. Well, not because of a wife, but I mean, the plagues and
Yes,
being in the
yes.
Right.
So part
Is
of
that
it,
the echo thing that you
that's
were
the echo
talking
thing. So
about?
part of what your question
Yeah.
is, that how I would explain it on one level, it's not definitive or the only answer, but these come from oral literature, and oral literature relies on genres and archetypes and repeating tropes. And
Okay.
so, you know, we're the people who came out of, we go in to come out of Egypt. you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
And so they're gonna keep repeating this, and they're gonna leave all these, because that's not what's important. It's just the main family line, and, you know, then that's why the begats, and now, and that this generation had to go to Egypt too, and then they came out. It's also makes
Wow.
it easier to understand and remember the story.
Yeah.
No matter what may or may not be true of its historicity. So.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I appreciate the opportunity.
Nicole Bray!
Definitely. Thank you. I found
have-
where I was confused about the age of Isaac. And it was right when Abraham is throwing him out. And it says he got bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, then placing the child on her back. He sent her
Yeah.
away as she
Well, see,
roamed
that's-
aimlessly.
He's
Yeah.
14,
He's
right?
14 years old?
Yeah, no.
So I don't know if that's an idiom, or I don't know. That seems odd.
Yes.
Because, I've seen a lot of 13 and a half year old
They're not
boys
going on
larger
anybody's-
than their mothers.
They're not
right?
going on
A
anybody's
lot.
back, right,
Probably
yeah.
hate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Um,
I'm
as
not
well
sure
as-
we can answer that, Mary. That's all. I'm not meant to be a cop.
The
I don't
other-
understand that
The
either.
word scheme. Scheme.
Let me look and see what the Tanaka says.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
It doesn't, I don't remember on your back.
Yeah, you don't remember that one either?
It's 2114.
Ages are all
Thank you.
bizarre.
It was in
It was a cartoon.
It was in the cartoon too.
Yes, it was.
He was totally on his mom's back,
The
wasn't he?
the ages are just bizarre and the whole.
Right.
narrative
mean,
here.
This
I mean,
says, Abram got up early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder
Oh,
and the
put it
child and sent her away.
So you can read it as the child and the skein is on her
there.
back,
Right.
but not necessarily.
No, there's a semicolon after shoulder.
Oh, see.
Oh.
And it's interesting.
There's a hard break there.
Okay.
He went
Well,
in.
he
There's-
was young.
I was wondering, rather than on her back, at her back.
Well, at her back would have made sense too, even if it was on a camel.
Yeah.
But
But-
that- You mean,
But
no,
I didn't remember on her back, and that's because this is on her shoulder.
And I
And-
think seeing the cartoon drove it home. This is a big kid.
yeah,
Get off my back. Get on legs.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
seeing
You're
her put
14
this-
years old. You're too big to carry.
Yeah, I'm seeing her carrying this kid and putting this little baby under a tree and praying, oh, gee, he's gonna die. And God hears the child crying. And I'm saying, okay, and then I see this picture of this 14-year-old. And it's like, what's going on? What
I don't
did
think I
miss?
realized that Ishmael was 14 when they were evicted until this last reading. And I probably read Genesis front to back half a dozen times.
wow.
Yep. It
So
happens.
even you can read this stuff and read this stuff and read this stuff, and you're still going to find new stuff in it.
That's why we keep talking about it, because they're just.
Yeah.
It up. They don't give you,
Yeah.
they don't give you the
Right.
finale. They don't do five when you want it, right?
Reinvent your own,
Or even Sarah, I mean, what happened, even Sarah, even all these women. There
Well,
were
they
their
eventually
lives. How about their
died.
magazines, and,
They eventually died.
They're like
But
120.
aren't Abraham and Sarah our first cousins or something?
Of
So
course,
they're,
Yeah.
they're closely related enough that the whole sister thing would go down.
Well, yeah, 'cause
wow.
he can lie
They
with
were
God.
half sister and brother.
Are they
Half sister and
really?
brother.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Same
Oh,
father,
that's-
different mothers.
They couldn't
Yeah.
have children.
Yeah.
from my
Well,
point of
yeah.
view.
Why would they be less likely to kill him if it's a sister rather than a husband?
Because if it's a sister, I can.
They
you
could
can
take
date
her
my sister,
anyway,
You can't
right.
date my wife.
Right.
For
Well, the
record.
other thing too is the Egyptians often married well, at least the upper class ones, almost always married relatives, and the pharaohs always married sisters, usually half sisters, but
Wow.
sisters.
Their gene pool was.
That didn't-
was
yeah,
terrible.
that doesn't-
Yeah, that's why you got some really, really stupid pharaohs.
That's right, yeah.
Right, that's
That
right.
doesn't work out
That's
very
why
well.
blood theology doesn't make sense over
Right,
the long
right.
term. We talked about that in another class. I mean, placing all this on bloodlines isn't just bad for the society, it's bad for the leaders of their generations.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean,
Wow.
more, it's before a few generations, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
but they knew that, they didn't know that
I mean,
then,
hey,
or
let's
they?
just look at England, I mean,
Isn't their incest is forbidden?
Well,
in-
if a pharaoh has 20 or 30 or more concubines,
That's true.
and
Yeah.
you marry a sister, the odds are that concubine has come from a far distant territory, and the only relationship you have is on the male line, so it's not as horrific as it would be for first cousins to marry now.
That's
Wow.
true, that's.
You know a lot about concubines, Foxy. That's why.
Sorry, I do. That's the archaeologist coming out of me.
Foxy, sorry. It's rambunctious in the room. We didn't hear what you said.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Foxy.
It's.
I said, I'm sorry, this is the archaeologist coming out of me. Or the anthropologist. And the religion student.
That's right.
And the sociology student. It's just kind of in there. All meshed up together.
I want to go back to slavery. And so there's been a whole lot of talk about slavery throughout this class because of it being so much a part of the world that generated this literature, right? So, one of the things, so slavery in ancient times, people often respond strongly to these statements, but they seem mostly to be true. Slavery in ancient times, for the most part, wasn't what we experienced in the United States and largely in the Western Hemisphere since the 16th century.
Okay.
Here, it wasn't like an entire class of human beings were just deemed to always have to be in slavery. It wasn't like just because your skin was black or you came from a certain part of the world that you were automatically a slave. And it wasn't in complete perpetuity. And it wasn't like the old law in Virginia, if you have one drop of African blood, you're black and you're not a citizen. There was never anything like that before the modern world. I mean, yes, there are definitely societies at times that liked to enslave a neighboring people that were definitely different from them. But it was more frequently a matter of a spoil of war. It was often, and they didn't know how else to do it. So one of them would be sold, or more than one of them would be sold into slavery. And many of the ancient societies, you could buy your freedom. Many of the ancient societies, it wasn't necessarily so that your children would necessarily be slaves, though that was true in some society. So what we understand as slavery in the United States of America, that's why they use that term chattel slavery, because the people who were enslaved, here were seen as like a different class of being.
Absolutely.
And they were herded like livestock and bred.
Right.
And you could have slaves, especially in Roman society, who were intellectuals, who were the scholars, who were the scribes.
But they
They
still
were the
had-
teachers.
Your bidding, in other words,
That's
they had
right.
to do,
Yeah.
you will be in this role and you will do that.
Well, if
therefore they
you
were
saw
slaves.
I, Claudius, and read Graves' book, I, Claudius,
Mhm.
you get a different twitch on who was the boss of who.
That's
who
right.
was slave.
Okay.
So.
Well,
which is
slavery at
very-
that point too was an honorable profession.
Say it again.
It was slavery at that point too was considered to be an honorable profession.
You were doing a useful task for a
Yes.
national prestige. Yes.
I mean,
Alright.
even if it's your own stupidity has put you in so much debt that you're at that point, it was still considered an honorable profession. I mean, it's not like you were the local shit digger.
Right.
You made a comment about it was the other group, though. It was always the other.
Often it was the other group. So not always. It could be someone who, looked and was born in the same town as me, maybe at a different social status. But often, but smaller societies often took slaves from like neighboring peoples that they conquered and warred.
Okay.
So it was many different things, but the way we understand slavery in the United States is sort of unusual in the history of the world.
Yeah. And to-
Is Foxy talking about slavery being a profession, something similar to
Think of
the,
it more in
um,
terms of an indentured servant.
upstairs, downstairs, the loyalty of servants to the
Mhm.
household?
Yeah. It was more,
Well,
it was more like, it would
The-
be more like what we would consider indentured servitude. You
Okay.
could sell yourself into slavery for X number of years.
And a lot of slaves were the teachers of the aristocracy.
That's
They
right.
were the ones.
Yeah.
You have Egyptian statues of the scribe. Well,
Right,
the
right.
scribes were usually slaves.
Slaves, okay.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
One of the things that I want us to end on, because one of the claims that FK, Frymer-Kinski makes, is that, most of this is an unusual piece of the Bible. Now, the Bible doesn't really speak out against slavery necessarily, but most of the time that we're seeing stories about people who are enslaved or captive, it does champion them being free. This is one of the few episodes in the biblical literature where a character or quote unquote hero or something like that, you know, who we know is enslaved, is told to submit to their slavery. You know, so whether it's, you know, Moses coming out of Egypt, you know, or other evidences in the biblical literature, normally it suggests that the God of this people wants the captives to be set free. It's not written as one of the rules of the Mosaic Law, sadly, but most of the stories and the main story of the people is coming out of Egypt where they once been slaves. So it's an enormous amount of tension in this story.
But
That
it's
was one of the
not-
reasons I objected to Christianity from the time I was
Go ahead,
8.
Wendy. Foxy, Wendy had the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's hard to
Yes.
see each other.
Yeah, so, but one of the things, like, when this was written,
Mhm.
they were enslaved by the Persians or the Assyrians or
Occupied,
whatever,
slave, yeah. Mhm.
you know, so therefore, they are going to talk about liberation. or-
That's right, yeah.
They were always being conquered by someone else because they're in that crossroads. If you look at a map of where, you know, Palestine and
Right,
Judah,
right.
Judah is, it's right there where people have to go to the sea from the east, or they have to go through if they're going north and south, or
Right.
so they were always being run over and
Right.
occupied.
So it makes sense that they're going to way of society, but wouldn't it be better if we weren't
Yeah.
enslaved? So, and the economy really couldn't run without slaves. They didn't have, you know, like a capitalist. I mean, they didn't figure it out. It's the same way in the Middle Ages with the serfs. They didn't figure out how to employ all these people.
Well, that's another conversation. All right, so, but Foxy, did you have something to add? Because we're getting close to time and I just want to make sure.
No,
folks-
well, actually,
Okay.
yes.
Yes.
Something Nicole said about the absence or the shunting aside of Black women during suffragette.
Yeah.
3 years ago, the LGBTQ community here in Columbus had a huge rift because the Black lesbians felt that they were being ignored.
Yeah.
Wow.
And yet nobody has talked about the Native American LGBTQs.
Yeah, yeah.
As much as you've been discriminated against for being an inside outsider, the red man is still an outsider completely.
Yeah, talk about inside or outside, inside.
And Foxy, part of the George Zimmel's concepts, the stranger has, you know, he talks a lot about another way of saying so, both far and near, like that paradox of far and near
Yep.
in there.
What does Grant Taker write about? You can see, you read about that, didn't you? Yeah.
I've read some of his work, but I don't remember exactly which ones.
Yeah, Foxy, where are you from? Where do you live? 'Cause
I live in
you're-
Columbus, Ohio,
what
and I
tribe
studied
or-
it at Ohio State University, triple major.
Okay, so what ancestry do you have?
I'm
Native-
Celtic and Native American.
But, so what Native American? That's what I'm trying to get.
I'm from the Bear Clan of the Mohawk tribe, Iroquois
Wow.
Nation.
Okay.
Boy,
Wow.
all right.
Before we go, could I read, would
Please.
you just on this question that, yeah, on page 233, is that right, of
Okay.
FK?
Yeah.
FK,
yes,
and
we
if you
love
look,
it.
I may skip right, but in the second full paragraph, the parallels between Genesis chapters 15 and 16 are striking. In chapter 15, God tells Abram that God will multiply his progeny, but that his descendants will be degraded slaves and that God will bring them out and give them the land. In chapter 16, God's angel tells Hagar to return to be exploited. Afterwards, she will have a child who cannot be exploited, and God will multiply her progeny. The story of Hagar parallels the story of Israel. She is the archetype. And then go to the next paragraph. I know we're close to time here, but it says, you know, essentially the question that was raised earlier in the hour here, why, you know, I'm skipping around. Why does God insist that suffering come before reward? And so the story here, this scenario repeats itself many times in Israel's experience, but nowhere is an explanation given as to why Israel and Hagar too have to suffer. And the only explanation Abram is given is that the inequity, is that right? Inequity of the Amorites is not yet full. This makes sense. Israel cannot inherit the land until the Amorites have polluted it so much that, in the words of Leviticus 18, it will vomit them out and Israel can come in. So, I mean, there's this question about, I think for me really seemed quite significant that we have tales that are suggesting and through Hagar, right? And then through Abram that, yes, there will be survival, right? Or there will be a we, right? There will be a we, and only through suffering. And hope for the oppressed, but suffering first. And I just think that's really sounded important.
It sounds sad,
Yeah,
right?
that sound, maybe right, yeah, so.
But isn't that also reflected in the New Testament? John went into the wilderness and suffered until he was told to come and prepare to baptize Jesus. Jesus went into the wilderness and suffered for his time. Jesus died on the cross and suffered immeasurably before he died and was resurrected. This is a recurrent theme. And if you think about it, we suffer to learn to tie our shoes or ride a bike before we succeed at it.
Well,
It's in failing that we learn. And what is suffering but a failure?
sort of pulling people in because they're gonna be suffering. And so look, but then there's this promise at the end of it, that is supposed to sustain
And
you.
you see that go
that
through
the
religion,
religion's
right?
for, right.
Completely, right? It's like their whole
I love your drawing,
parts of
so, yeah.
religion
No,
that
that's
like
right.
love something, right?
No, but they're.
I just think it's a way of telling you to suffer. Go ahead and suffer. Just accept it because you'll get a reward somewhere down the line.
I understand I'm gonna
There's a
suffer,
Marxist in the room right here.
but don't tell me I have to always put up with it. I understand I'm gonna suffer, but don't tell me I'll be a better person
No, but,
afterwards.
Oh, and then you'll go to heaven.
but hang on,
I'm
because
going there. I'm
better
going to
is
New
coming
Testament, Old
someday.
Testament,
That would be.
next Testament, I'm going
You'll
there.
have
Right.
Yeah, but
God
that
doesn't give you anything you can't handle. We know that, right?
that could be just human nature in that,
Yeah.
first of all, we're dealing with ancient people who didn't live that long. I don't care what it says in the Bible.
Hey,
No
And
100-year-old dads. huh?
And life wasn't that easy for them. So what are you gonna do? Sit back and say, you know, screw it, I'm just gonna suffer? You have to hope.
Well, it's
This is part of human nature.
but it's
You
the
have
same
to
thing
hope.
today. It's a lot of what religion is based on. that
Yeah,
way.
but you don't have to have religion in order to have hope.
No, of course
in
you
life.
don't. Of course you don't. I
Right.
agree. I'm not saying
But
that.
they coined it
But
in a religious
I'm saying
way.
that's what a lot of religion though is based on.
Right, you have to have hope. And, yeah.
And there's
Or
this
not.
idea that virtue.
yeah, well, that's right.
That's right.
Right.
Catholicism was like that. You suffered for your sins.
Oh, yeah.
Everything you do, offer it up to help clean your slate. You got a pain, you got a toothache, offer the suffering up to God to help clean your slate for your sins, help atone for your sins.
All right, well, we can all go home and
Suffer some more.
dream on how much we want to suffer, because we, depending on how much we think we need to be improved. But this was great. I want to thank you, Nicole, for preparing tonight.
Thank you, Nicole. We're still getting that coffee.
I couldn't tell. I didn't
Yeah,
see
right.
any joy coming out of it.
Right.
But you know, so
It was
next
very
week,
good.
class number 5, and yeah, and I'll
Do you
send.
want to do Bathsheba and Huldah, or we're gonna move on to the Warriors?
The Hulda's so short, I'm not sure we need Hulda, that we might read some of that from the women as voices in
Okay.
general. We'll see which one of those works the best.
So what chapter are we talking? So now
I'll
we're
be
on.
with your wife next week.
Well,
So I'm gonna go ahead and stop the